We first want to begin by acknowledging that although we might not all be situated on campus or in Toronto at the moment, it's important to acknowledge the land which we are on. We acknowledge the traditional territory upon which we gather today. This land has a long and tangled history that carries the storied footprints of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and Mississaugas of the Credit River nations who have sought to walk gently on this land. They offered assistance to the first European travelers to this territory and shared their knowledge for survival. Toronto has a treaty with the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation and is part of the Dish with One Spoon agreement to share the land between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee nations. In moving toward reconciliation, we seek to polish the Silver Covenant chain and to restore the relationship with the original peoples of this land, one based on honor and deep respect. For those of you who are new to us, Students for Shelters is a recognized student group operating on the U of T St. George campus. We are recognized through ULife and the UTSU. The mission of our group is to encourage the school community to take local action and to donate smaller items to organizations that are not always thought of, such as socks and feminine hygiene products. We also strive to participate in other forms of action to raise awareness and act in solidarity with those in need. Our community unites students from diverse backgrounds and brings them together under one common objective, helping others. And in turn, we are hoping to create a lasting impact on students and others' lives in a positive way.
Good evening. My name is Brianna. My pronouns are she, her. I am a co-founder and co-president of Students for Shelters. ILLUMINATE is a series of panels occurring throughout the year. The theme for this panel is food insecurity or access to food, our fourth panel of the ILLUMINATE series. This is our fourth of 5, and we hope to see you at the final one. Hope you guys enjoy.
Thank you, Brianna. Good evening, all. My name is Hannah, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm also one of the co-founders and co-presidents of Students for Shelters. I'm so glad to get the series kicked off again this term and to delve back into the topic of accessibility to food and nutrition. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for your hard work in helping us make tonight happen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Frances, and my pronouns are she, her. I am the Vice President of Students for Shelters and incredibly excited to be here with you all today. I'm thrilled for us to be hosting our fourth panel already, and I would like to send out a big thank you to our executive team, moderator, and all of the guests we have with us today. I will now ask our moderator to introduce herself as I hand off the conversation to her.
Thank you, Frances. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. My pronouns are she, her. This is my second year as note-taking secretary for Students for Shelters. I am deeply passionate about environmental and social justice issues facing our local communities and abroad, and I am so excited to be moderating our panel for tonight. I'm delighted to introduce to you to our wonderful speakers and their organizations for this evening. First, we have Daily Bread Food Bank. Talia Bronstein is the VP of Research and Advocacy at Daily Bread Food Bank. Daily Bread is a member-based organization representing over 170 food banks and meal programs across Ontario. The organization believes that food is a human right and no one should experience barriers to accessing food. Talia leads the organization's annual research report, Who's Hungry?, and works with community coalitions and government to advocate for systemic change. We are also accompanied by Feed Ontario. From securing fresh and healthy food sources to driving change through policy research and innovative programming, Feed Ontario unites food banks, industry partners, and local communities in working to end hunger and poverty in Ontario. Caroline Stewart is the organization's executive director. She has served with the organization for over a decade in various roles and is passionate about food security and social justice. Last but not least, we are joined by North York Harvest. Sarah Watson is the Director of Community Engagement at North York Harvest Food Bank. North York Harvest's mission is to engage our community in meeting the food needs of Northern Ontario by providing dignified food assistance, education, focused advocacy, and long-term food solutions. Sarah has spent the last 13 years working in nonprofit organizations focused on poverty and food security with a commitment to both immediate emergency support and long-term solutions. Now we will begin with our panel questions for this evening, focusing on 3 key themes: poverty, food banks, and COVID-19. Prior to the panel, we asked the S4S community to send us any questions they had regarding our topics this evening, and we will hear from some of those questions at the beginning and throughout, and then more at the end. All of our questions are open to all the organizations unless specified, so please chime in if you have anything to say. So our first questions for everyone are, would you be able to elaborate on the mission and vision of your organization?
I can jump in first, guys. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us tonight. Sarah touched a little bit upon the work of Feed Ontario, but our vision is to end hunger and poverty in Ontario. And our mission is that we feed Ontario by creating opportunities and solutions and uniting local food banks to eradicate hunger and poverty. Obviously, hunger and poverty are very complex issues, and part of the role of Feed Ontario is to collaborate with a network of organizations across the province to make sure that everyone has the best access possible to supports and services. So we work, all 3 of us work alongside one another to do this work. And really our vision really centers around hunger and poverty, because you can't have hunger without poverty as being a symptom of a much larger and complex problem. We changed our vision in the last few years just to make sure that it was inclusive of that. That's a little bit about us.
I can go next. Yeah, in a similar vein, Daily Bread. So we're a Toronto-based organization. So we work from Etobicoke to Scarborough, except in the area that North York covers, which Sarah will talk about. And what we do is we deliver food out to a whole bunch of different agencies doing different types of food programs. So food banks, meal programs, snack programs, breakfast programs, that sort of thing across the city. So getting food out the door is one part of our mission, but also similar to what Carolyn's saying, it's really important for us to be doing that advocacy work so that people don't actually have to come to food banks. That's kind of our goal, is that, you know, when somebody comes to a food bank, that it's for meeting a very temporary need. Whereas what we're seeing right now is people are having to rely on food banks long term because they're living in poverty and they simply can't get out of poverty. So that is a little bit about what we do at Daily Bread.
And I'll go next. I'm Sarah from North York Harvest, and as Talia mentioned, we are in the North York part of Toronto. So between my organization and Talia's, we cover the city. And what we do is pretty similar to Daily Bread. We distribute food to our member agencies who run frontline programs across North York, and then we also run 4 frontline programs ourselves. So we do both the distribution and the immediate community service. And we're committed to supporting the immediate needs because people are in crisis right now and do need that immediate food support. But as was mentioned by my colleagues, that we know that's not going to solve the long-term problems. We're very committed to advocacy work and education work and policy work to work towards long-term change to eradicate food insecurity, which is driven by poverty in our city.
So what are some of the common misconceptions people have about food insecurity and poverty, and how does your organization work to conquer them?
Sure, I'll jump in on that one. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions. I think first is that, you know, Canada is a wealthy, prosperous country, so there probably aren't very many people experiencing food insecurity. So I think that's the first misconception, when we know that there's more than 4 million Canadians who are experiencing food insecurity at the latest count. So that's a pretty significant portion of the population. Another misconception, I think, is that food insecurity is just about food. There's a lot of great work that happens, the important work that happens on, you know, community gardens and in agriculture and that sort of thing, and those things are really important. but they also don't get at the root cause of the food insecurity in our city, which is really being driven by poverty, as Sarah and Carolyn have mentioned as well. So food insecurity not being about food is another one. And then I would say the final one I'll touch on before I pass it over is that people who go to food banks, maybe aren't hardworking or aren't doing everything that they can to lift themselves out of poverty. We hear that a lot. And it's a misconception. It's a huge misconception, because once you're experiencing poverty, it's extremely difficult to not experience poverty. And we know that some groups disproportionately experience poverty. There's a lot of barriers, there's discrimination that leads to marginalization. So the idea that it's kind of an individual responsibility thing is another misconception that we see.
I think Talia really covered a lot of it there, and I'd be in agreement with pretty much everything she said. And we see a lot of misconceptions on sort of an individual level too about who's coming to our programs, what kind of people, why they're coming, when ideas around what's brought them there. Things like not knowing how to budget is something that we hear a lot. A significant percentage of our community members using our programs are on social assistance, and the sort of average amount that a single person on social assistance gets is about $733 a month. And the average one-bedroom apartment in Toronto is over $1,000 a month. So you can't budget $733 into $1,000. It's not an issue of budgeting any more than any of us could benefit from a budgeting class, which I'm sure we all could to some extent. But it's not so simple. As Talia mentioned, there are some very deep systemic issues, and people are marginalized for a lot of reasons, and it's not an even playing field.
And the only other thing I would add to Sarah and Talia is a common misconception is that food bank use or food insecurity is about sufficient food. So there being sufficient food in the country or province, when it's really not to do about with how much food actually exists, but rather people's access and income to be able to support themselves. And then more tangentially is that people believe that food banks think they are the solution to food insecurity is a common misconception. Food banks do not believe we solve insecurity, but rather that we are serving a symptom and helping to address that emergency need, the immediate emergency need. And that's why we advocate for long-term policy change, because that is the solution to food insecurity.
Thank you for sharing that with us. This last question was created by Erica P. How has COVID-19 changed the usage of food banks and food programs? Has it changed any of the processes that food banks use to organize?
Yes, it's changed a lot of things. For North York Harvest, and I think the same will be said for my colleagues, it's just we're in a different world completely than we were a year ago at this time. It's not the same all across the province, but in Toronto, we've seen huge increases in the number of people accessing food banks. In North York, where I'm a little more familiar with the numbers, it peaked at about, I think, 75% increase year over year in the summer. In a normal year, if we saw, a 5 to 7% increase in demand, we would say that is significant and that's worth talking about. So a 75% increase is like nothing we've ever seen, nothing we ever imagined seeing. And in North York, we saw the closure of a lot of programs when COVID hit. So we're serving significantly more people out of significantly fewer sites. And we've had to change the way we operate our programs completely. We really pride ourselves in offering dignified programs that are welcoming and that offer choice. And we spend a lot of time with our participants, and just so many of the things that we used to do for health and safety reasons, we simply can't do anymore. People are in and out as fast as possible. Choice is limited. We just have to, health and safety has to be the lens that we first look at all our programming choices through.
I can speak more from a provincial perspective. I think the response to COVID-19 was incredibly varied across the province. Toronto really, or GTA really took the brunt of that initial huge increase in terms of clients served. That being said, in communities that were very hard hit by COVID-19, we saw similar situations. That being said, for all food banks across the province, they really saw huge challenges in terms of having to pivot and adapt their services, as Sarah was talking about, to address those, social distancing guidelines. There were food shortages, particularly at the beginning. There were labor shortages related to reduction in volunteers, so no longer being able to have volunteers in their facilities and having to rely solely on staff members or a limited skeleton of volunteers. And just with that, there's been, lack of choice or changes to services and a huge variety of impact. And really, from a provincial lens, what kind of some of the scariest part is, and if we use the 2008 recession as an example, we saw our highest numbers on record 2 years after the fact. So food banks, in fact, see the ripple effects of large economic downturn a few years later, mostly because people will take other methods to try and not have to use a food bank. So they'll use up their savings, they'll stay with friends, they'll use alternate means to support themselves. And so for the food bank network, I think our capacity is being stretched very, very thin due to COVID. And then with that, we anticipate huge growth in demand in the coming months. So it has drastically changed the way we do things, and also drastically changed the way we anticipate the future and try to figure out a new path forward.
When I think about the things that were worrying us a year ago, it seems so quaint to think back to sort of, as Sarah mentioned, like when we used to see a small increase in food bank visits, we would get very concerned. And last January, we saw a 7% increase year over year. And we thought, oh my gosh, what's driving this? We need to do research. We need to try and figure out what's going on here, because this is, really problematic and worrisome. And then, it's just exploded since then. And we're expecting that this year we'll have the highest number of food bank visits we've ever seen in Toronto. I think one of the other challenges that hasn't been mentioned is the fact that we rely really heavily on volunteers. So usually at our at Daily Bread, we have a warehouse out in Etobicoke. It's this huge building, and usually we have 60 to 80 volunteers there every day that would help us sort food and get all the food ready to go out on trucks to our different programs. And when COVID hit, we had to scale that back dramatically. Usually it's kind of like a beehive of activity in there, but we scaled that back to now we have about 20 individuals there each day. And that's made things a lot more difficult in many ways. The interesting kind of byproduct of that is that we're only allowing regular volunteers in because we're trying to reduce sort of the turnover of volunteers. But the interesting part is that our volunteers now are very efficient because they're there all the time. So that's sort of an interesting positive thing that's happened. But we do miss having a lot of people around. And I'd say the other positive thing that's come out of it is just new partnerships and different ways of thinking. And we never used to, we had a lot of informal collaboration between different agencies. So North York Harvest and Daily Bread, we've always collaborated a lot. But for example, there's other organizations in the city like Second Harvest, which is a food recovery organization. There's the Canadian Red Cross, there's Salvation Army, Food Share. All these are organizations that do food distribution to help low-income individuals. And when COVID hit, all of a sudden we decided to all get together and really problem solve together. And when one organization, needed assistance, the other organization would step in. And that was a really positive thing that's come out of it that I'm quite certain we'll see carry forward. But it was born out of necessity, because I think every organization, every social service organization in the city was really struggling, especially at the beginning when we were all sort of figuring out how to adapt our services, what are the health risks. There was a lot of unknowns back in March, especially. So that time of adaptation was quite a challenge.
Thank you for sharing that insight about how the pandemic has affected Ontario's food banks. So now we're going to move on to the next set of questions about the issue of poverty. So our first question for everyone is, how have the issues of poverty and food insecurity evolved over the recent years? And have the issues of poverty and food insecurity improved at all? And has the government's handling of these issues improved as well?
There's a lot there. That was a lot of, there's a lot to chew on there. Maybe I'll start with some of it, and then the others can take from there. As far as how things have evolved, I think that there is a better understanding of what food is, I mean, the term food insecurity, what food insecurity is, and what it's caused. You know, all three of us have mentioned that food insecurity, at least in Toronto and in most of Ontario, is driven by poverty. It's not an issue of there not being enough food. People don't have access to the food they need because they don't have the money to access it. So really sort of, you know, North York Harvest really views itself as an anti-poverty organization as much as a food security organization these days. And I think there's a lot more, that's a much more common understanding and approach to the issue than it used to be, which is exciting to me. I think there's a deeper understanding of what the root causes are, and that we need to see true systemic change. But to a great deal, that does have to be driven by the government. I think that there's still a long way to go as far as how the government is handling it on all three levels: municipal, provincial, and federal.
Yeah, and I think if you look at poverty statistics, so if you look at the Government of Canada has on Statistics Canada, they have a poverty portal, or poverty hub, I think it's called, Dimensions of Poverty Hub. And you can see the national rate of poverty is going down. If you look at the Ontario data on poverty, you can see that it has kind of stabilized. It's gone down a tiny bit. But at the same time, we see food bank visits rising rapidly. So the question is kind of what's going on there. And I think what's important to know there is that the people who are experiencing poverty, we see a lot of deep poverty. So the depth of poverty might be growing. I haven't seen the trend on that. So that's just my kind of reflection. But I think the cost of living continues to go up, and we see growing inequalities. And so I think that means people are deeper and deeper into poverty. And we also see, you know, certain groups are more likely to experience poverty. And when we see improvements in poverty, it's because the government has made very concerted efforts to support those individuals. So for example, we've seen a reduction in children in poverty in Canada. And that's because the government implemented a child benefit. So when you have a child, there's different income levels. You would receive an amount of just sort of an income transfer for that. And that's really helped. Same with seniors, there's guaranteed income for seniors. So these are populations that the government has made a concerted effort on, but we see a whole bunch of people kind of in the middle. We see single individuals who poverty has most certainly gotten worse for, because there's just really no income support programs for single individuals other than social assistance. And Sarah mentioned social assistance rates are extremely, extremely low. So overall, I would say poverty, there has been some progress made with poverty, but there's so much more that can be done and should be done. And, you know, I'm sure we'll get there, but, you know, there are very concrete steps that the government can be taking that they just haven't taken yet. But I'll save that for when we get there.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have too much more to add to Sarah and Talia. They've been very eloquent about the issue. I think from a provincial lens, in terms of the research we've been doing, just from a food bank use perspective, who it is that's accessing our services is shifting year over year. It used to be over 40% of those that we service were children, but as Talia mentioned, with the child tax benefit or Canada Child Benefit, we've seen that decrease, and it remains steady at about 33%. But what we've seen is an increase in single person households accessing our services. We've also seen an increase in employed people accessing food banks. So those are people with either minimum wage jobs or working precarious work, having to now access food banks. And then that, coupled with some other factors like affordable housing and cost of living increase, are really kind of shifting it in terms of food bank use to people that are accessing our services. And so a lot of government supports, as Talia has expressed, are really not catering to those individuals who are in need of support right now. So there's a lot more the government can be doing to be making change, particularly around social assistance and housing. But there are many key recommendations and policy changes that are needed quickly.
So many families turn to food reduction strategies when facing food insecurity, such as reducing the food quality rather than quantity, stretching out the duration of food so it lasts a bit longer, or parents and elders eat less to feed their children. What can people who face food insecurity do instead of turning to food reduction strategies?
So I think this is a bit of a tricky question, because I think when people get to the point where they're using those strategies, they've run out of other things. If there were other things to do, they would have done them by this point. This is something we look into a lot in the Who's Hungry report that Talia leads and that we provide some support on. When you have budgeted every single thing that you can budget, there's only so many things you can do. You can't pay less rent. You can't pay less hydro. There comes a certain point where you can't budget that down anymore. And if you don't have enough money, all that's left is food. It becomes the last flexible line in your budget, and you save that for last. So when people are at the point where they are skipping meals or lowering the quality of food that they're feeding themselves or their family, it's because they've run out of other options. We see this again and again, and you'll see it too among parents. They will skip meals so that their children don't have to, but people skip meals so that they can pay their bills, so that they can pay for transit to get to work, all sorts of reasons. But I don't really have a lot of tips on what else people can do, because when people get there, they've hit the wall. Those are the people that we see. They come to food banks.
And I'll just add that when those individuals come to food banks, we still see, food banks can't provide the full range of food that a household would need to be able to eat a proper diet. Food banks are really supposed to be a stopgap. So we do our best to provide fresh fruits and vegetables and dairy and eggs and kind of fresh groceries, but a lot of the food that we provide is by donation, and a lot of it is shelf stable, so like canned food. So even going to a food program is never going to be able to close that gap, and it shouldn't close that gap, because the problem is, again, it's not food, it's the income issue. And I'll just talk really quickly about the right to food. What does that mean in Canada, and whether Canada has any legal obligations around the right to food. So if you think about, Canada has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Lots of countries have kind of specific rights that they recognize. So food is something that Canada has signed on to international declarations. The International Declaration of Human Rights lists food as a human right. Here at home, we don't have any domestic policies or laws or charters that recognize food as a human right. So what this means is the right to food as a human right doesn't mean that the government has the obligation to feed every person. It means that the government has the right to create an environment in which people can access the food that they need. And so that means that an environment would be that they have access to food, like they have the geographic access to food, to nutritious food, culturally appropriate food, but that they can afford it, right? So you need the income side. And what we're seeing is when people are reducing their food intake, their human right to food is not being realized. And even if they come to a food bank and get some groceries to help them out that week, the right to food is still not being realized because they should be able to afford the food that they want and need to live a healthy life. So Canada is not meeting that obligation, and that's why we're seeing that happen. So it should cause grave concern amongst everybody in Canada that that's happening, because it just shouldn't be in a country like Canada where there's enough food, there's enough money to go around to prevent that kind of thing from happening.
So our next question is going to be for Feed Ontario, but if Daily Bread and North York Harvest would like to add anything, please feel free. So what policy recommendations do you have, if any, for the Government of Ontario or the Government of Canada to improve issues of food insecurity?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. And I know Sarah and Talia do some great advocacy work and have recommendations also from both North York Harvest and Daily Bread. From Feed Ontario's lens, we update these regularly depending on obviously changes in government and changes on key needs of our sector. The first recommendation that we'd make is providing immediate income support to those impacted by COVID-19 through the reinstatement of the emergency benefit for social assistance recipients, as well as providing immediate rent relief to low-income tenants who are facing large rent arrears or eviction due to COVID-19. In addition to that, obviously overhauling Ontario's social assistance programs to ensure that recipients have the resources and means to move out of poverty. Specifically, we are now looking to align that with the national standard that was set by CERB. So as Sarah mentioned, if you're someone on Ontario Works, you make $733 a month, and the Ontario Disability Support Program, I believe, is around $1170 right now. But with CERB, you're receiving $2,000. So a much different standard and a much different income level as they set a line around the market basket measure. So social assistance definitely, it has not increased with inflation since 1993. So significant amount of time. And finally, investing in a strong workforce to ensure that working Ontarians are able to earn enough income to afford today's cost of living. So developing better labor laws and policies that benefit those who are employed, including the reinstatement of paid sick days, equal pay for equal work, and quality jobs that provide a livable wage.
So thank you for all your answers on the issue of poverty. Next, we are going to move to questions about food banks all across Ontario. This first question is for Daily Bread, but again, if Feed Ontario or North York Harvest would like to add anything regarding the areas that they specialize in, please feel free. September was Hunger Action Month in Toronto. Over the course of COVID-19, many individuals and families have experienced food insecurity. How does this affect shelters and food banks? What is being done to address the surge in insecurity?
So I would say not a lot is being done, unfortunately. We have certainly seen an increase, and I think what is really driving that increase during COVID is a couple things. One is that people before the pandemic didn't have many savings because they were working in low wage, precarious work, and rent is really high. And so at the end of the month, you don't have money left over to be saving up for kind of a rainy day. So when the pandemic hit, we saw that, people, if you had your hours reduced at your job or you were let go from your job, there was no safety net to kind of cushion that. So people really quickly needed to turn to food banks. We also saw that people who live on fixed incomes, like people who receive social assistance, they actually weren't protected from the pandemic because the income rates are so incredibly low. So what has the government been doing? They've done some good and important things. I'd say that at the start of the pandemic, there was a real push to get a lot of different benefits. So we had the government of Canada put in the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB, which gave $2,000 a month. That prevented a lot of people from having to come to a food bank. We can't quantify how many, but we know without CERB, the rates would have been huge. Things like putting an evictions moratorium in place early on in the pandemic. That was really important to protect people, to allow them to stay in their homes. So there was a lot of response early on, and Feed Ontario actually put out a report that has an amazing graphic in it that you should check out, but it shows kind of the timing of all these different supports, and they're all right at the beginning of the pandemic, and then you sort of see them dwindle away. And now here we are, and we're seeing, you know, there are still some income supports at the federal level, but we're not seeing enough. We're just not seeing enough. We have a huge unemployment rate still. We have people who, you know, aren't able to shelter in place because they don't have appropriate housing. We have people who don't have sick days, so they have to go to work, and that puts their health at risk, that puts other people's health at risk. So we need government to be responding a lot more than what they're doing at the moment, and it's difficult. It's a difficult situation to be in because there's so many problems, and everywhere you look, it's sort of a new problem. Long-term care is in crisis. Everything is kind of in crisis. So I think the government is very much kind of being pulled in many directions, but that's why it's so important to do advocacy work, and for people like yourselves to get involved and to kind of bring attention to these issues to government, to say, we need you to be doing more. I feel like I strayed from the actual question, which I can't even remember what it was anymore. I apologize if I went rogue there.
That's okay, it was perfect, thank you. So a part of Students for Shelters' mission is collecting donations for shelters and various organizations around the GTA. What types of food is most often donated and under-donated at food banks? And what are foods are least nutritionally valuable?
I mean, I think what you want to think about is what you want to eat and what you want to feed to your family. So obviously, you know, primarily shelf-stable things, non-perishables, because of the way that we operate. But whole foods, things that are ingredients that can go into other foods, are really important and really key, because then people can get things and put them into, to supplement their groceries and to put them into the meals that they like and that are familiar to them, and to their families. So think about what you want to eat, what kind of food tastes good to you, is healthy to you, and that's the kind of stuff. We have a specific list of things we ask for, just that we think, you know, meets the needs of the widest array of people and can fit into sort of as many cultural backgrounds as possible. But we ask for canned beans, canned tomatoes, rice, grains, and pasta, canned fish and meat, and one that people often don't think of is cooking oil, because it's very expensive and it's something you really need in order to cook food at home. But yeah, I'd really think about what you like to eat and what you want to feed your family, and that's the same thing that our community members want to feed their families.
I would echo Sarah completely. The only thing I was going to add was also culturally appropriate food, diet-specific food. In a lot of circumstances, people who are visiting food banks have diet-related challenges, and often that food can be incredibly expensive. And then also just addressing your question around nutritional food. I think, you know, we all have, I think having a variety of things in your cupboard is always important. Just like I'm sure everyone on the call probably has like cookies in their cupboard at some point, or buys a chocolate bar on occasion type thing. We want to always make sure that there is a significant amount of choice. So for people accessing our services, so they have the choice to determine what's best for them and what they would like in their cupboards.
In your experience working with food insecurity, given average diets, what areas of nutrition do they usually lack in?
I mean, think it's tricky. Oh, Talia, did you want to go?
Nope, go for it.
I try to be careful about making assumptions about families and individuals and what they're eating and what they're not eating. You know, the food bank is a supplement. People are buying groceries. This is sort of an addition. And they come to sort of know at their local program what kind of foods that they might be able to expect to get. So they're going to buy other things and then use this as a supplement. So I think one of the sort of unconscious bias we have towards people using food banks is that they may not have the same level of understanding about nutrition or how to cook. But studies have actually been done about that, and there's no correlation between cooking skills and poverty. And people have just as many cooking skills who are low income as who are wealthy. There really isn't a correlation. So people know what they should be eating just as well as non-food bank clients. So again, I think it's just trying to get as much variety, culturally diverse, whole foods into our programs is the best, so that people can get what they need, and then they can supplement what they've already purchased.
Thank you for all your questions on the theme of food banks. We're going to move to our last question section regarding COVID-19. And both of these questions were suggested by Kellyona. As a result of COVID-19, many programs for snacks and breakfast foods have stopped. A lot of younger students, due to food insecurity, rely on these programs for nutrition during the day. Is it possible that this could affect their learning abilities, and what can be done to promote or help these students?
Can take that one. So there have been a lot of studies to show the importance of breakfast and meals throughout the day with student learning. So those programs are really important. And I think in Toronto, I read that there's 200,000 individuals who receive school meal programs. So that's a pretty big number, that especially in March when schools shut down and everybody was adapting, like those programs went on hold for a little while. And we certainly saw an increase in families with kids, and some of our clients were telling us, you know, all of a sudden I have my kids home and that's more mouths to feed. So it's certainly a challenge to my understanding, and I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is that some of these programs have restarted, and there's been a lot of great initiatives across the city to do home delivery programs to school-age children, to kind of think outside the box. Some individuals have been receiving gift cards or sort of frozen meals through these programs. So there are some workarounds that have been happening, but again, in my ideal world, if we're sort of picturing what the solution is, again, it would be ideal if no family had to rely on a meal program through the school, that every kid could show up at school already having had breakfast because their family could afford not only the food to make breakfast, but had the time, that had the flexibility in their schedule to make sure that that all the kids had food. So again, it comes down to an income issue and a work and employment issue. So there's some temporary kind of stopgap solutions, but the real heart of the problem still remains.
Given the CESB and CERB programs, what are some tips to budget money for nutritious foods?
I mean, I think it sort of goes back to what I was talking about earlier and what we talked about earlier. We don't have tips on budgeting for people who are already budgeting every penny. I mean, I think that we could all learn a lot about budgeting from our community members who are using our programs, because, you know, they're turning $733 a month into all of their costs. So they're pretty good at it already. You know, the CERB and the other benefits have been a huge benefit to a lot of our community members. They've, as Talia said, they've kept a lot of people out of the food banks. We've been very lucky, but in Toronto, $2,000, depending on how many people are in your household, still, may well not be enough. I think these benefits are important. They're vital. We'd like to see them stick around. We'd like to see $2,000 become a new benchmark for things like social assistance. If it's the level that people needed to meet their basic needs throughout this crisis, why isn't it the level that they need to meet their basic needs outside of this? But again, I just don't think it's a budgeting issue. It's access to that income. The way we can solve this is by giving people money.
I just add, this is a little bit slightly off topic, but I'm just, your question sort of made me think about, there might be students who were relying on employment, and that employment has reduced hours or isn't available anymore. I know a lot of students were struggling in the summer to find summer positions, some of whom were eligible for those income support programs. So, especially for people who maybe have never experienced food insecurity before, who have never been at a place where they were wondering, am I going to have enough money for groceries? I guess the advice I would give is to go to a food bank, because they're available and they're free, and there's no judgment, zero judgment, and you don't have to provide a whole bunch of documentation. You don't have to prove your income. You basically just have to show up. And there's a food bank at the U of T. So I think also just, letting people know that option exists, and there's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of, because as Sarah said, this isn't a personal failure. It's not about whether you can budget or not. It's not about whether you have been responsible in saving. This is an income issue, and it's affecting millions and millions of Canadians. And that's what food banks are for. They're there to help kind of bridge that gap. So I hope that anybody watching and anybody who you share this with, and anyone just knows that they are very, very welcome to come to a food bank whenever they need it, because nobody should have to skip meals or reduce intake of food.
Thank you for all of your answers on the following themes. That concludes our panel questions for this evening, and we will now move on to the audience question period.
Prior to the panel, we asked the S4S community to send us any questions they had regarding food. We've already heard some of their questions throughout the panel. Here are some more we wanted to feature. So our first question comes from Erica D. Produce and fresh food tend to be most nutritious, but in regards to donations, due to storage life, we are recommended to donate canned or boxed goods. What foods should we look to donate that are most nutritious within the canned or boxed item category?
I think it's important to, just because something's in a can doesn't actually mean it's less nutritious. If it has a lot of additives or extra sugars or things in it, sure, but a can of chickpeas is good and healthy. A can of peas is good and healthy. I think there's a bit of a bias as to obviously people want fresh food, and we want to give out fresh food, and it's delicious and it's great. But just because something is in a can does not mean it's not as healthy for people. So I think that's an important thing to note. And other than that, I just sort of circle back to what I sort of mentioned before around whole foods and things you'd want to feed your family.
I also want to just make sure that, I think Sarah and Talia both touched upon it, but food banks do give out fresh food. So, I think it's a misconception, mostly because it's an easy way to donate either at your local grocery store or to have food drives. Food banks are unfortunately a little bit of victims of their own success, in the sense of they've really hammered home the non-perishable or shelf-stable items as an item to donate. But at Feed Ontario, we play a bit of a different role because we're not a physical food bank, but we service food banks. But over 70% of the food that we actually distribute is perishable, so fresh or frozen. And, you know, all the food banks we have as part of our network have fridges and freezers. They give out dairy, protein products, you know, cheese, milk, meats, produce, all sorts of different things. So sometimes I think it's a bit of a misconception again around what food banks do, what they give out, and what they may have available. While the core stable pantry items are core to anyone's household, at anyone's cupboard, we also supplement with those fresh foods as well.
This next question is from Erica P. Has COVID-19 led to more people seeking out the food bank services or less?
Yeah, definitely more. Just for context, at Daily Bread, we used to serve approximately 65,000 individuals per month, and now it's 110,000. So a pretty huge increase.
And our numbers have increased around that same percentage level too. So we've seen a huge increase. I mean, Carolyn may have a little more insight. I think it is different community to community. The cost of living is so huge in Toronto that I think we have felt it to a degree that maybe not all communities have. So the CERB was a flat rate across Canada. So there are communities where $2,000 a month goes a lot farther than it would in Toronto. And I think that in some communities, they may have seen a decrease in the number of people accessing food banks because for the first time, people actually did have the money they needed to meet their basic needs. But Carolyn, you could probably speak more to that.
Yeah, you know, I think Sarah touched on a lot of points. The other thing to keep in mind is throughout, you know, particularly the first 6 months of the pandemic, there were a lot of pop-up supports as well. So organizations who, you know, city workers who were shut down for whatever reason, were then redirected as volunteers to support programs, or people had opened up and, you know, there's now a new meal program or a new support through another organization that wasn't there. So in a lot of circumstances, we do believe some of the need was dispersed across a number of agencies that fall outside of our network. But then obviously serve in certain communities, particularly those hardest hit by COVID-19, you know, GTA, Windsor, areas like Hamilton, which already has higher numbers to begin with, obviously saw really huge increases, but then other communities, rural communities, where, as Sarah mentioned, cost of living is much lower, housing is more accessible. CERB allowed people to weather that storm a little bit better. But that being said, now that we've seen all of those supports wind down at the end of the summer and people's qualification no longer qualify for certain things, particularly CERB, we've seen those numbers across the province start to rise again. So as I mentioned earlier in the discussion, we do anticipate over the next 6 to 12 months seeing an increase province-wide.
Thank you so much, all of you, for those answers. We will now begin the live audience question period. So just a reminder to the audience that we ask that you use the raise hand function to let us know that you have a question to ask. And we'll call upon you in the order in which we see the hands go up. You can also type your question in the chat box and it'll be read aloud by one of us if you're uncomfortable coming on the mic or coming on the camera. And we actually already have a question in our chat, and I'll read it out loud. And it says, wondering, do grocers donate the fresh food to the food bank?
I can jump in. So yes, the answer is yes. So the large grocery chain, so Loblaws, Sobeys on occasion, Walmart, where they provide fresh food, have retail recovery programs. So they do donate fresh product. Feed Ontario works directly with Metro Ontario, and we're just currently rolling out a program called One More Bite, which is about fresh product donation. That being said, we actually work for our fresh food donations primarily with the agricultural sector. So Ontario is very, very lucky. We live in a very bountiful province with lots of access to agriculture. So we work with people like the dairy farmers, the egg farmers, pork farmers, beef farmers type thing, to have fresh product donated to the network. Because in terms of grocery chain fresh product, a lot of it is very short dated. So it needs quick turnaround time to be able to get out first to food banks, but then into the client, our community members' homes, and then giving them the chance to also eat that food before it spoils. So while it exists, there's definitely still improvements that can be made.
Thank you, Carolyn.
So our next question is, what are things that students can do to help out food banks during this time when many places aren't accepting new volunteers?
So I think there's a couple different ways. I think what you're doing right now is awesome to kind of help raise awareness. I think the most important thing you can do is help us advocate. We need people to contact their government officials and let them know that you want to see more action on poverty reduction. So what you can do right after this call, super easy, just go Google like find your MPP, your member of provincial parliament, and it'll help you find out, like, put in your address, what riding do you live in, who's your MPP, find their email address, send them an email, say who you are, say you're a student at U of T, you live in their riding, and you just heard a presentation with, you know, Feed Ontario, Daily Bread, North York Harvest, and you learned about the huge increase they're seeing in terms of food bank use, and you want to know what are they doing to advance poverty reduction. You want to see food bank use decreased, and you want to know what they're doing about it. So putting that pressure on government is how government works. It's how change happens. So that's the beauty of living in a democracy, is that we can contact our elected officials. I know this is a little bit more future facing, but there's going to be some elections coming up. So there's probably going to be a federal election in the next year. There's going to be a provincial election by June 2022 at the latest. It could be earlier. And those are really important opportunities to help shape who's in government, because who's in government gets to decide what are the policies, how are they going to deal with poverty reduction, how are they going to deal with affordable housing, all these hugely important questions. So that is the most important time to influence who's going to be in government. So volunteering at a political campaign is a great way, first of all, to learn how politics works. They're always looking for a bajillion volunteers. That's how campaigns are run. So I'd really encourage you to stay tuned for those election opportunities, and to stay in touch with your elected officials, and make sure that they hear from you, because they do want to hear from you.
I completely agree with Talia, and I'd just add, you know, don't be shy about it. I think a lot of people sort of hesitate to reach out to their elected officials because they don't feel that they're experts in the issue. And you don't have to be an expert. You need to let them know that this is something that you're concerned about, and you clearly are, because you're here today. And that alone is significant. It's their job to fix these problems. It's not your job. You could certainly give them ideas if you have them, and they should be listening. But even just calling and saying, I am concerned about this, if enough people call and say they're concerned and say they want to see some change, that's enough to make change happen.
Thank you for your great answers. So going off from the panel, I have another question. It was mentioned that there's a lack of obligation to food in the Canadian Charter. So does that mean there's a lack of accountability in the government? And what can we do to hold the government accountable?
That's an awesome question, and a complicated one. So from a legal perspective, there aren't very strong accountability mechanisms around the right to food in Canada. Our obligations are very much at the international level. So the UN sent somebody here to kind of evaluate how are we doing with respect to meeting the right to food, and they found we're not doing very well. In a country as rich as Canada, we really shouldn't be seeing anybody having food insecurity, but we actually have, as I said, over 4 million people. So we're not doing so great. There aren't a ton of accountability mechanisms from a legal perspective. What there are accountability mechanisms baked into democracy. So that goes exactly to what we were just talking about, that the government is accountable to you as a citizen. you have the ability to help shape who's in government, and then regardless of who's elected, whether you chose them or not, they're still accountable to you. You're their boss. So I'd say that's the biggest accountability mechanism we have is by executing our democratic voice and holding government to account.
So another question is, attending a food bank is not always enough for some people. What can the rest of the community do to ensure they're getting a sufficient amount of food?
I mean, I think attending a food bank isn't enough for a lot of people, a significant percentage of the people that we're supporting and working with. I think a lot of people will go to multiple programs. There are meal programs, there are various drop-in programs. There's a lot of different things out there, and people sort of weave together ways to make sure their needs are met. People shop in a lot of different stores to ensure, you know, they're getting the best bang for their buck. There's a lot of different things that people do. Someone said to me once, community member said to me once, being poor is a full-time job. It's exhausting because you have to do so much work and you have to put so much thought into it, because there is no one-stop answer to meeting all your needs.
Thank you, Sarah. We have a question in the chat, and it says, what role does the government play in food banks? Is it primarily funding?
So the answer is none. Food banks do not receive government funding. So I can speak specifically to provincial funding. The first time we've received provincial funding was in April of this year, or in 2020, sorry, and it was specifically to execute an emergency program related to COVID-19. Prior to that, we had received $0. So I can speak for the majority of food banks in Ontario. They do not receive government funding, maybe through the form of grants or to execute specific programs related to government programs locally, or alternately, they may receive funding from their municipal government in certain circumstances, but the large majority are funded directly from donations through partners, foundations, or generous individuals.
So you also mentioned that food banks give out fresh food. What are some examples? And what fresh foods can the community donate?
I think Carolyn listed a fair number of them. You know, through Feed Ontario, we get milk and eggs and meat when we're lucky. It's been really lucky lately, which has been amazing, because it's one of the first things that people cut from their budgets because it's really expensive. So we do offer those things. In the summers, we get more fresh produce from farmers and relationships with local farms and maybe large community gardens. But the produce one is tricky because you can't really donate it in the way that you might normally. I think if you know a local food bank that does direct service, you could call them up and you could say, look, I'd like to make this donation. And that's a good way to sort of approach any donation you might want to make to a food bank. Is, you know, I can tell you what we are looking for, but call your local program and say, what is your community looking for? What are your specific needs? Because it's going to vary site to site. It's going to vary based on what they've had donated as of late. It's going to vary based on who's coming to their programs. So it's always good to ask.
Can I just add, the other thing you can keep in mind when COVID is over and we can do in-person events and things like that, sometimes there's a lot of excess at events, and there might be an opportunity to donate that to a food bank, but usually what's a better fit is Second Harvest that does food rescue. So I just wanted to flag their services as well. They before COVID, well, they're still doing it, but they work with a lot of restaurants and that sort of thing to rescue food that would otherwise go in the waste and get it to people who could benefit from it. So that's another option as well.
And another thing, this might be a bit tricky right now, your students, the student life is not a cheap one. But a lot of food banks, not all, but a lot of them will have some amount of food purchasing budget. So if you donate funds, then they can use those to buy the food that they need at any given time, which can be really useful because they know exactly what they need. And they can use that money when they need it the most. And often they can leverage better prices than you would be able to in a grocery store because they're going to buy in bulk.
Thank you so much. And yes, Second Harvest is an amazing organization. They spoke with us in November, which was amazing to hear from them. So yes, thank you, Talia, for bringing them up again. We have another question in the chat here. Have there been less donations to food banks since COVID-19, whether that be food or actual money donated?
I think we've all been really lucky during this period of time. Communities have really stepped up, which has been really needed. I think our organizations all have seen an uptick in the amount of funds being donated, and food to a certain extent has become a bit trickier to raise food the way that we normally do. We haven't been able to have the food drives that we normally would. I know Daily Bread hasn't either, but we've been very lucky, and we would not have been able to continue offering the level of support by any means without the support that we've received from community. Everything is more difficult now. Everything is more expensive now. We have to buy things that we didn't before. Sanitizer, PPE, all of these things, and we've received donations of those things, but there's just so many things that we have to do now that we didn't. So that support has been vital.
And I would echo what Sarah said, also from an operational standpoint, in a lot of circumstances across Ontario, many food banks have had to either hire additional staff or even hire their very first staff. Many were exclusively volunteer run prior to the pandemic, but just the requirements, because there's been such a reduction in volunteers, as Talia spoke to earlier, just the demand of resources and time that's required to fulfill all of the things that food banks do are just not meeting it. So whether it be PPEs, staffing, they also need more facilities to help create, additional programming, because a lot of them are running emergency programs or need additional supports. And a lot of times we've also seen other agencies actually turning to food banks for direction and leadership. So whether it's fulfilling program needs, helping to assist them if their doors had to close, all that sort of thing. So a lot of investments have been made across the province into those items.
Thank you so much for your answers.
Yes, thank you. That was so great. And that actually takes me into one of my questions. It might be a little bit redundant, but hopefully not too much. So as was previously discussed, there has been an increased demand for food banks over the past few months. And I think, Carolyn, you mentioned earlier kind of the idea of a new path forward for food banks as demand is projected to keep increasing. So what are some of the major changes that food banks are taking in order to accommodate this? And as you previously mentioned, you said that community plays a large involvement in increasing your capability to meet this demand. Is that part of the major role?
Yeah, I don't even know where to start in the sense that, there's so many question marks, I think, for everyone. And we have no idea what our environmental complex is going to look like even 6 months from now. I think if you told us in March last year, this is where we would be, I don't think any of us could have imagined this. I think a huge thing that exists within our sector is just the sheer exhaustion of people who are working in social services right now. There's significant burnout, significant resiliency issues just because they have had to work around the clock for 10 months straight to address the need, and that is not slowing, and the pace is just so quick that people are, and then that being coupled with rising demand just makes it almost insurmountable. I think in a lot of circumstances, as I said, people are having to staff up. Even our organization is growing quickly to address operational needs. I think also many are looking into facility changes. They're also looking to, business continuity plans, adapting services, seeing, some do, as I don't know if we spoke to it already, but some ran drive-through models or takeout meal programs or a bunch of different services. But in terms of, they relied on, city workers or volunteers that were not employed at that time, but now they're going back to work. So they're having to find those resources. So really, I'm not sure that everyone has the perfect plan in place, but rather we're trying to set up a series of sequential things to make sure that we still have, as always, enough food to meet the demand, that we keep our doors open as long as people need them. And that I guess we continue to advocate for change and those key things, because even things like when the moratorium on eviction was lifted in, I think, end of August, early September, eviction started very, very quickly across the province. And so that's a huge area of concern. So I think just making sure that we're doing that immediate advocacy to help address that short-term need as well.
Thank you so much.
So what are food banks doing to protect employees, volunteers, and clients?
Do you want to go, Talia? You want?
Yeah, good.
Okay, we're doing a lot. We put a health and safety lens as the first lens that we do all of our program planning from at this point. Obviously, getting food to people, our advocacy, our anti-poverty work is vital, but we look at everything as health and safety first. So we've put a lot of measures in place, too many to sort of go through now, but we stopped using volunteers completely for quite a while. We've slowly started to bring them back in, but in very specialized ways. We have 2 full teams. We've spent most of the last 10 months in 2 full teams, an A-B team, so that if anybody gets sick on our staff, we can isolate that whole team, and bring another team in to replace them so that none of our programs will go down. We have, sorry, it's been a while since I've gone through. I should have let you go tell. Yeah. Basically, we've tried to bring in all of the supports that we can to make sure that our staff feel safe and protected and have everything that they need. And I say staff, but I mean our staff, our volunteers, and our community members. Most of our programs have moved to appointments where they were drop-in before, so that we can reduce crowding, the number of people in any space at one time. Most of our programs are actually operating out of doors now, because it is safer to keep people out of doors. And so what have we had to bring in to make that happen? Heaters and tents and stuff like that. How can we keep our teams off of transit? How can we make sure that they have, unlimited sick days, all sorts of things like that. Anything that we can sort of bring in to ensure everybody's safety.
I'm really shocked to hear that governments don't fund food banks directly. Is there a possibility that this could change in the future through like public lobbying or demand, or even with new governments coming into office?
I think I think I can speak for Talia and Sarah on this. Food banks aren't the solution to food insecurity. And so for us, the idea of governments funding us really institutionalizes the idea that we are the solution and or a crutch for the government to not do anything further. Really, it's about investing in the individual so that they have sufficient income to be able to afford all of their needs. And so for food banks, we never really advocate for funding to be coming from the government, but rather for them to be making smart public policy decisions so that our services are in fact not needed.
Okay, thank you. I didn't think about it like that before, but thanks for that.
So another question is, could a universal basic income be more effective than relying on food banks, soup kitchens, or etc.? Why or why not?
I can talk to this one. So yeah, universal basic income is something that has been getting a lot of attention recently, because People have sort of talked about CERB being, basic income program. I would say a couple things to know about basic income. First is that we already have some basic income programs operating. So for seniors, for kids, those are income supports that basically function as a basic income. They're not universal. So there is a foundation to be built on. In my opinion, and Daily Bread's opinion, we believe very strongly that there should be a guaranteed minimum income floor, that nobody falls below that. So based on income, if you lose your income, you're going to get a certain amount, and that needs to be a livable amount that brings you to the poverty line. So we support that very much. I think the challenge with the universal basic income, so there's a couple different ways of talking about basic income. Usually when people talk about a universal basic income, they're talking about a program where every single person receives a set amount of money, and then people with higher incomes, it gets taxed back. So for people that, let's say, I'm just making this number up, make $80,000 a year, $80,000 a year or more, they receive that basic income every month, but come tax season, they have to pay it back. That is a solution that I don't see as being productive to poverty reduction, because what ends up happening is that because you're giving every single 36 million, however many people there are in Canada, an amount, it would be very, very expensive. So what you're going to have to do if you're government is you're going to have to give people an amount that's not that big. Whereas what would be more effective is to give everybody who is below a certain income threshold a much greater amount. Because if you're giving people a low amount of money, you're going to have to fund that somehow. So you might take away other services, but people might actually end up with less than they're getting now if they're low income. So I think a basic income is a really promising solution. I think we just have to be very careful and practical about what that model looks like to make sure that it targets the right people and make sure that it is designed with poverty reduction in mind, to really lift those people who are lowest income out of poverty, the people who would benefit most from that basic income.
I think I'd just add too, and I agree with everything that Talia has said, and I'm a big fan of giving away money. I think it's a really good approach. But sort of one concern that has been raised around basic income is if we were to move to something like that, ensuring that there were still other supports that came with it. So our social assistance program, which is very flawed, don't get me wrong, very, very flawed, does come with some level of wraparound supports. It does, and if we were to move to some sort of basic income, we would want to be sure that that also came with some level of wraparound supports. So it wasn't just, here's your check and we'll see you later. We don't want to take a step back as far as other supports that we are giving our community members now.
So we have another question from the chat, and this one is from Ashley. She asked, this has been talked about a bit, but aside from donations, what are some ways to show support in other areas, such as emotional support?
I think we've touched on a few around, advocacy work. For us, the Hunger Action Month kind of centers on 4 areas: educate, advocate, volunteer, donate. I know in a lot of circumstances, like right now, volunteering and perhaps donating funds aren't just possible, but educating yourself and advocating on who it is that accesses food banks, why they're accessing, what the need for income supports is, recommendations for change. If you visit any of our websites, all of our research reports are on there and our recommendations for change. Even something as simple as following us on Twitter to keep up with key trends around food insecurity and issues related to poverty reduction. And really just, I guess from an emotional standpoint, having an open mind and an open heart, understanding that people who access food banks are just like anyone else who have unfortunately fallen on difficult times and had to access support. So there's a lot of judgment around people in poverty. So I think making sure that you remove that lens and kind of go into it with an open mind and look to always educate yourself on issues of food insecurity and social justice.
Thank you, Carolyn. We have another question in the chat here from Ryan. And Ryan says, first of all, thank you for a great evening. Do you feel that the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed any flaws in the system or any unforeseen needs for food banks?
I think for some people, I think what it has done is it's really shone a light on needs and gaps in services that a lot of people already knew were there. You know, I think a lot of people, just food banks themselves, I think a lot of people didn't really understand how food banks work, government included. You know, when they closed all the public spaces in the first lockdown, which I'm not going to say was the wrong approach, but also declared food banks an essential service. You know, when you close schools, food banks are in schools. When you close churches, food banks are in churches. When you close community centers, food banks are in community centers. So one of the big problems that we faced early on was we actually had enough food and we actually had, you know, funds being donated, but we didn't have, and we had people who needed these things, but we didn't have a way to distribute them because so many of our programs got shut down. So I think that's something that the city understands a lot more now than they used to. And they've done a lot for us as far as stepping up and helping to provide spaces. But we have one of our biggest programs and that's seen the most growth over this. It used to serve a few hundred people a week. It now serves a few thousand people a week. And it's moved 5 times in the last year because we do not have access to permanent, accessible, appropriate, affordable space. And that has been a huge issue for programs like ours and lots of social service programs. But to deal with that on top of everything else that we're dealing with and to have to move a program that people are relying on has been a real challenge.
I would say from our perspective as well, a flaw is one that the capacity of the food bank network is finite. People assume we have this unlimited capacity just to continue growing and continuing meeting to a need, but you know, this is the type of problem that doesn't matter how much money you throw at it, we can't grow to meet that need indefinitely. So one, obviously working with government, and the other thing is that food banks are not a part of the emergency planning system in Ontario, and they should be. So while we did, you know, work in partnership with the government, that was at a proposal from our organization, as well as, you know, the work on the ground from local food banks. I think, you know, Tali and Sarah can speak to their work with local government, but from a provincial scope, you know, we were declared essential workers, but no one spoke to us about it. We had no information. How is that defined? What does that mean? What is our role? Are we allowed to stay open? And also just that, you know, I think maybe not a flaw, but a benefit is just how incredibly resilient the food bank network is. To say the people that work at food banks are incredible is an understatement. Every single one of our organizations has remained open since the beginning of the pandemic. I think the longest one was down was 2 days, just to regroup and reset. And they've been running full force since that time. So one, it's been, as much as they are tired and haggard and exhausted, they are incredible people who have done incredible work. So I think that, you know, we knew the network was very resilient, but this has demonstrated that a lot of people, one, were very resilient, but that a lot of other organizations have turned to our network for support as well. So from our standpoint, it demonstrates strengths of organization as well.
Our next question comes from Erica P. She says, do you have any recommendations for documentaries about food insecurity, poverty, statistics, etc., or any media that you recommend we check out? Anything educational?
I don't have any documentaries that I can think of about those topics. I would say if you're interested in statistics, I can give you a couple recommendations. Don't know how nerdy you want to get, but as I mentioned, the Government of Canada has it's called the Dimensions of Poverty Hub. That's a really great resource. Another amazing resource is housed right here at U of T, and that's Proof Food Security Research Institute or something like that. They have been tracking food security trends in Canada for many years, and they have amazing reports and infographics and resources and all sorts of stuff. I will just say that we talked about some of the misconceptions about food banks, and you'll see some of them live on that website, particularly just some of their documents kind of talk about how food banks see ourselves as being the solution to food insecurity, when, as we've mentioned here today, we really see ourselves as meeting an immediate need that, you know, we don't think that it's the right solution. We think the right solution is income. So I'd say just take that piece with a grain of salt, but all the rest of the resources are top notch. And in terms of media, I mean, the Toronto Star has some great reporters covering these issues. Unfortunately, they do have a paywall, but it's possible through U of T you have access to that. I don't know, Sarah and Carolyn, do you have any other ideas?
I'm trying to think. I'm sure as soon as we're done, I'll think of loads. There's actually, it's not a perfect fit. There's a great TED Talk. There's a doctor called Gary Bloch, B-L-O-C-H, I think. And he's a TED Talk about prescribing income as a medical intervention, which ties very much into, although it's specifically about income, it ties very much into a lot of the work we do and just the impact on so many things by people's health and well-being by prescribing income to them. And it's a really cool approach and really interesting idea. So I'd recommend you check that out.
And again, not to selfishly push all of the reports on North York Harvest and Daily Breads in our website, but there's lots of research reports on there. Also, the only documentary I can think of is called A Place at the Table. It's actually not Canadian. It's about American food insecurity and food banks. It's quite dated now. I think it's from 2012, 2013. It was part of Hot Docs during that time. But that, I think, gives a very personal lens on food banks and poverty and those who visit their services. So I think it would still be applicable from that side.
Thank you all so much. We have another question in the chat here from Maria. And Maria says, I understand that the load has been overwhelming on homeless shelter due to the pandemic. What is the best or most effective way to help my local food bank right now?
So I think the work that we do gets equated a lot or connected a lot to homeless shelters. And I know that, you know, North York Harvest and Daily Bread does send some amount of food to the shelters, to certain shelters to support their community members, but we don't work directly with them as far as programming. So I can't really comment on the shelter system, though I know that there's a lot of stress and a lot of pressure. It's you know, you can't get much more frontline than that. But I think as far as the way best way to support your food bank or your local shelter is talk to your government. They need to make change. They need to solve these problems. We are there to sort of meet the immediate vital need. We do similar work to shelters. Shelters are in that shelters are addressing an immediate need. People don't have somewhere to live right now, but a shelter isn't going to solve the housing crisis. Affordable housing is going to solve the housing crisis. Reasonable income, living wages, good jobs, paid sick days, that's what's going to solve the income crisis and food insecurity.
I would just add probably the best, if you're looking kind of in your neighborhood and wanting to lend your hand of support, I'd say just contact the organizations in your in your area, like, you know, you can Daily Bread, North York Harvest, Feed Ontario, we're kind of bigger umbrella organizations, but at the very, very community level, if you walk by a shelter or a food bank and, you know, take down their name and look them up after and just call them or email them and see what they need, because sometimes there's very specific, hyper specific things, you know, like the drop-in meal program near my house is looking for takeout containers, those black takeout, you know, so it just depends on the place. So you can just give them a call directly.
Thank you, Sarah and Talia. I actually have a question now, kind of around the concept of access to food as a human right. And it was mentioned earlier that the UN came to Canada and was assessing food banks and their efficacy. So I was just wondering, as you mentioned, the government doesn't really play a role with food banks. So when the UN comes in, do they talk to food banks directly? Every food bank? Do they sample? Or would you mind elaborating a bit on that relationship?
Yeah, so when the UN came to do their study, it wasn't about food banks specifically, it was about Canada as a country. I don't know the ins and outs of that. It was in 2008, I want to say, or maybe 2012. So it was quite a while ago now. I'm not sure exactly what they did, but my guess is that, educated guess, is that they did an assessment of Canadian policies, what was in legislation, what was in all the different policies, and then they looked at food security rates, and they looked at income supports, and they looked at all of those factors that play into food security, and they made their assessment there. So they weren't, the UN wasn't coming in to say food banks aren't achieving the right to food. It was that the government as a whole, in all of its policies, every single thing it's doing, they're not meeting their obligations. If that clarifies. Great.
Yeah, that does help. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat from Elizabeth, and Elizabeth says, a lot of marginalized people don't have the access to the same resources as higher income zones. What can the city do to ensure that these communities have access to the same resources?
I guess I would say that if we're taking an equity approach, so there's a difference between equity and equality. So equality means everybody gets the same thing. Equity means that you take into account sort of people's individual needs and contexts, and you provide what people need based on that. So I would say that what marginalized neighborhoods need is more resources, to be quite frank. I think that there are a lot of intersecting factors that lead to marginalization. There's racism, there's xenophobia, there's income inequalities, there's discrimination based on disability. Like, there's a lot at play, and I think we need to fix some pretty structural things in order to address that marginalization. So I don't think there's a magic kind of solution or any one kind of investment. I think always the solution is to look upstream. So instead of saying, okay, we see people in these neighborhoods have food insecurity, so let's invest a lot of money into food banks. We would much rather the government take that money and say, okay, why are people going to food banks? Oh, it's an income issue. Okay, let's give people income and address the problem there. So I think the other thing to keep in mind is that different levels of government have different roles to play. So the City of Toronto as a government, they don't have a lot of power or money to address these big kind of structural issues. There's definitely more work that they can and should be doing, and the City of Toronto is doing their budget consultations right now. So this is actually a great time to contact your city councillor and tell them what you want to see happen. But we need to look to the provincial government as well, to the federal government, who have bigger budgets and can address some of those more structural issues.
Thank you, Talia. And we just want to announce that we are getting close to the 9 o'clock hour, which is when we'll be ending. So we'd just like to invite anybody who has questions now to either raise their hand and ask them, or just go ahead and type them into the chat like we've been doing, and we'll continue to read them out loud, just so that we have time for our conclusion.
I'll just add to something I said earlier. I just noticed one of the questions in the chat again is asking about what we're doing to protect our community members, be they employees, volunteers, or clients. And something I neglected to mention is something we did early on and have been consistently working very, very closely with Toronto Public Health. And we created a set of pretty strict guidelines based on and in conversation with Toronto Public Health as far as health and safety and what needed to happen at programs and what practices needed to be in place to ensure the best possible environment to protect everybody's safety. And so those were sent out I think March 12th. I think the schools and everything closed down. March 13th was the last day before everything closed down. We sent out those guidelines March 12th. And any of our programs that we run or that we work with that can't meet those guidelines, we worked with to make sure they had the capacity to do it. And we aren't running any programs that can't meet those public health guidelines and ensure everybody's safety.
And just from like, I guess, more general lens, food banks have adapted services to, increase physical distancing, limit things. So they've created drive-through models. Many have started home delivery services as opposed to, unfortunately, having a shopping model. They've moved to a hamper, so less interaction between people. They've also moved to appointments, as Sarah mentioned. We worked with Daily Bread to launch something called Connect as part of our intake system so that clients could register in advance prior to coming to the food bank. So again, to limit time and exposure at facilities. So a bunch of different practices like that alongside public health guidelines and ensuring that they're meeting those.
Thank you for those additional comments. I'll ask another one of the questions that's in the chat from Ryan. And Ryan says, is there a clear connection between higher food prices and the rise of poverty?
So I would say that food is just one piece of people's monthly expenses. So the biggest expense people have every month is rent. And when we think about, sort of a person's finances, there's the income that comes in and then all the expenses that you have to pay for. So I'd say poverty is mostly driven by the income side. So how much income you're making from employment or how much income you're making from income supports like social assistance. And then on the expense side, food prices certainly play into how much money a person has and how much food someone can afford. But I'd say rent is probably one of the bigger drivers. But food prices have been going up. So it certainly adds pressure on people, and it can contribute to things like food bank use, where when people's incomes stay the same, rent stays more or less the same unless you're getting kicked out and having to move, and then your rent goes up actually a huge amount probably. But let's say you're in the same apartment and food prices go up, that can make the difference between being able to make ends meet and not being able to afford all of your bills and all of your expenses. And so that's where a food bank might come in.
Thank you for that comment, Talia. So we have one more question here, and it is, how can we figure out where the nearest food bank is located? Is there a website where we can search this up?
That's a really good question. So there's a couple of different ways. if you are in North York, you can call us, and I should have all my websites and phone numbers and social medias on hand. I don't, I'll get them. But you can call, we have a referral line, and we will connect you with the best program for where you live and that meets your needs. And then the same goes for Daily Bread, has that same service. You can also, there's a 211 is a phone and web service that is like 411, but for social services. So you can find out about any sort of social services that are in your community. But yeah, we'll connect you, or Daily Bread will connect you, or go to 211. And during these times though, I would always recommend just confirming operation times and hours and things like that, just because things change a lot due to COVID. It's not quite as predictable as it once was. So go to www.northyorkharvest.com and click contact us or find a food bank.
We also have a find a food bank function on the Feed Ontario website if by chance your hometown is outside of the GTA and you want to find where your local closest Feed Ontario member is. We also can do that, search by postal code.
I have one more question here. Would raising minimum wage significantly help reduce poverty or take a strain off of food banks?
Yes.
Definitely.
100%. Do it. Call your local government. Ask them for it. It's very important.
Thank you. We have some more questions coming in the chat. Another one says, the closing of some food banks due to COVID has been an issue for many people. What can be done to tackle this issue?
I mean, this has hit us particularly hard. We saw a huge amount of closures. We saw more than half of our programs close within a week of the pandemic being officially declared. You know, we are sort of larger organizations here at this table, but a lot of the community-based food banks are very small. Many of them are completely volunteer run. They may have no budget, they may have no staff, they may not even have permanent space. So they're run, they're precarious. And a lot of volunteers in these programs are seniors, so they're high risk. And it's not safe for them to be running these programs. So we did see a lot of closures. And we've been really lucky that others have stepped up to partner with us. So both North York Harvest and Daily Bread partnered with Toronto Public Library to open pop-up food banks out of libraries while they were closed. We're still running 2 of those in North York, as well as the YMCA and other agencies that had a little more capacity did either start new programs or extend their hours or add extra days to meet the need and try to take on the clients for programs that have closed. But we still don't have, we are not back up to where we were. We don't have the level of network. People are having to travel farther. People have less choice of days and hours when they can access food banks. It's a significant challenge for us.
So we have another question in the chat that says, do you have any advice for people wanting to work in positions within the food bank? Any education or courses you suggest we take? Or is anyone welcome no matter the resume/experience?
I think it sort of depends what type of a role you'd be interested in taking on. There's a lot of different types of roles at food banks. From a volunteering perspective, there's certainly a lot of different opportunities available and you don't need a lot of prior experience. For employment, I'd say, you know, just check out our websites and positions are posted there when we have them. But, you know, there's a variety of positions. So for example, my job is research and advocacy. So I have skills in qualitative and quantitative research and government, policy making. We have people at our food bank who have done more kind of social work type or community worker type roles. They do more frontline service provision and coordinating our programs. We have people with lived experience who have gone on to coordinate those programs. We have people who do our communications. We have people who do finance. We have people who do HR. We have people who work in our warehouse, our forklift operators. So there's a really wide range of skills and positions. So I think it sort of depends what your interest is. But I always sort of, for anybody looking for career advice, think of the kind of job you want and sort of work your way backwards. So, Google, if you're interested in, I'm just using research because that's my world, but, research analyst job, look at the position, look at kind of the skills they're looking for and sort of work your way backwards and say, how could I get there? That's one approach. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. The other thing I was just going to say is student placements are a great opportunity. So if you're interested in working at a food bank, we often do have like Canada Summer Jobs positions for people who are eligible. We often take like practicum placements or internships. So that's another great way to kind of test the waters as well.
I would also just echo our staff is all super varied in their backgrounds and how they got to us. I would just say one common thread is, a huge passion for social justice, community issues, and community engagement. Working in the nonprofit sector, you'll get that across the sector, but that's probably key if you're interested in working in any form of social services. To be honest, my background's in criminal justice and public policy, but I fell into food security kind of through a back door and loved it, and have played primarily in this organization prior to a role as ED as in operations, so not on the policy side of things. So I think just keep your options open, and also key experiences. A lot of our operations people have actually worked for food companies, or they've also worked in distribution and logistics. So much different lens than kind of your upfront, thoughts about a food bank or nonprofit.
Thank you so much to both of you. So we have one or two more questions here. I think this might be the second last one. And you mentioned, sorry about that, a car just pulled up. You mentioned a lot of produce donations come from farmers. How are these partnerships established?
Yeah, so we partner. So I think there's much more time needed to even get into this. I would say research what supply management is if you don't know what it is. So Ontario is very fortunate to have very structured agricultural programs, particularly in the turkey, chicken, egg, and dairy industries. So for us, they have provincial representative bodies. So same as kind of us representing food banks, they have the same version for farmers, as well as people who process food. So for us, it was about facilitating how we can leverage how to get something from farm to food bank and working on that partnership to utilize it. So it was a lot of relationship building. It started in 2013. In some circumstances, our dairy program is over 25 years old, but the rest of the programs are less than 10. So it's really about stakeholder building and kind of the farming community is incredibly generous. So they wanted a mechanism to give. And so we just helped to format that for the food banks.
Thank you, Carolyn. This is just the very last final call for any questions. So if anybody would like to unmute their mics and ask a question or send a last-minute question in the chat, now is the time to do so.
So, hello, I had a question. What would be the impact of, I think, increased career training to help augment the career lifestyle of low-income individuals?
I mean, I think one of the things that is surprising to a lot of people is just the levels of education so many of our community members have. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I bet Talia knows them off the top of her head.
40%.
But that 40% of our clients have post-secondary education. So it used to be, you know, going to university or college was a very good and path to stable long-term employment. You know, if not a guarantee, as close as you could get, and that's just not the way things are anymore. So, you know, 40%, and that includes masters and PhDs. Like this is a really big problem. Education is absolutely, it's important, and it is a path to a lot of things, but it is not the answer, the only answer.
Thank you very much.
So as we conclude tonight's event, we want to give a huge shout out to our executive team. None of this could have been accomplished with your hard work and dedication. Our team has been working hard planning these events since mid-July. Each of our executives has contributed so much to the Illuminate series, from panel questions, promotional materials, outreach, planning, and organization of notes and funding. This truly would not have been as successful without all of your help. Your work is extremely appreciated by Hannah, Francis, Sarah, and myself.
We also want to thank all of our community members. Without your support and dedication to these events, they simply would not be as powerful and as successful as they have been. So from all of us, thank you for volunteering your time to these causes, and thank you for being an active community contributor. And most definitely, we want to thank our amazing speakers from Daily Bread Food Bank, North York Harvest, and Feed Ontario. As a token of appreciation, Students for Shelters has donated to your organizations. Thank you to those who have donated. We appreciate your contributions greatly. Again, to the panelists, thank you for your work. Thank you for helping us kick off our semester 2 panel series with such high regard. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for all the questions. It's great.
Good night.